Which was part of the message after the 70th anniversary of her accession. Hello, welcome to the Health Check from the BBC, show with the latest in colonial health news. I'm Lauren Chesterton. Today, we dig into a huge Lancet report that says we're doing death more and the terrible consequences of low uptake of the COVID vaccine. In our study, died after pregnancy.
Good morning, Grish ma'am. Good morning. Good morning to all of you. In fact, I have come to my village and I'm just enjoying the beauty of the greenery here. A lot of beautiful plants and trees, the coconut, the jackfruit, all that is quite wonderful and I really enjoy the beauty. It's quite chill here. It's quite cold morning, wonderful cold morning. I can listen to a lot of beautiful bird cries. And in the city, I miss all this all the time. But this morning is great for me. This Sunday morning, back at my village, back at my home, just looking at all those friends in the lap of Mother Earth. These coconut trees, these jackfruit trees, all the rubber trees, and all the other wonderful plants and beautiful green leaves. Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm good. I'm good. I'm back in my village with my parents. It is, of course, the place where I have grown up my boyhood days. Beautiful looking at all the wonderful plants and trees just dipped in snow. It's very cold here. I really enjoy this morning. I come here very seldom and I'm just capturing the beautiful moments in the morning because I may miss it in future when I'm in town. Beautiful. Lot of ash gods there. These ash gods are good for making curry. Lot of ash gods there. The thing is, often these ash gods are wasted. This is wonderful if you make it. Maybe you can use it for any kind of curry. This is wonderful. Maybe this lunchtime today we may have some curry with this because I like it. A lot of ashgards lost, wasted all the time because nobody wants it and it is on top of the tree.
Making care of people at the end of life, death and dying, a part of the social responsibility rather than something that is a medical problem that should be managed by doctors and nurses. Well, let's zoom in, Carola, because not everyone around the world has a specialist doctor like you, and less than 4% of the population in India has access to palliative care. So many of them endure pain at the end of their life. But one of your colleagues on the Lancet Commission, Dr. Kizhuparamba, has played a key role in driving end-of-life care into a new approach in Kerala.
Yes, Ashraf, I am in Thottumukkam. Good morning. I came here yesterday. ഇന്നിപ്പോൾ ലോക്ക്ഡൗൺ ഒക്കെ
So
ആണല്ലോ.
I can see
നമ്മൾ
in the
ഗ്രാമത്തിൽ വന്നു,
scenario where someone is
പേരൻസിൻ്റെ
going to
കൂടെയാണ്.
die,
ഇവിടെ
it's
ഉണ്ട്.
one of those situations where everyone wants someone to take charge.
നമ്മളെ മാവും
And
പ്ലാവും
the
തെങ്ങും
normal thing is that you
ചുറ്റുമുള്ള
refer
മരങ്ങളൊക്കെ
to a
കണ്ടിങ്ങനെ
medical
നിൽക്കുകയാണ്. നല്ല
professional
തണുപ്പുണ്ട്.
because they
ഇറ്റ്സ്
know
ഗോട്ട്
more
ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ
about
ഹിയർ.
this. But you're saying
ക്വൈറ്റ്
that
ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ.
that's not how
രാവിലെ
things
എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു രാത്രിയെല്ലാം കുറേശ്ശെ ഇങ്ങനെ മഞ്ഞ് പെയ്യുന്നുണ്ടായിരുന്നു ചെറുതായിട്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു നല്ല തണുപ്പുണ്ട്. ഇറ്റ്സ് റിയലി ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ എൻജോയിങ് ദി ചിൽ ഇൻ ദി മോർണിംഗ്. ഞാനിങ്ങനെ ടെറസിൽ ഇതെല്ലാം ഒന്നിങ്ങനെ ക്യാപ്ചർ ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. എൻജോയ് ചെയ്യുന്നു. ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ. ജസ്റ്റ് വാക്കിംഗ് ഹിയർ. സൂര്യൻ ഇങ്ങനെ ഉദിച്ചു വരുന്നുണ്ട്. സൂര്യൻ്റെ പ്രകാശം ഇങ്ങനെ നമ്മളെ നേരെ വരുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ കുറച്ച് സൂര്യപ്രകാശമൊക്കെ കൊണ്ടിങ്ങനെ നടക്കുകയാണ്. യാ. വൈറ്റമിൻ ഡി. വെരി ട്രൂ. ഞാൻ അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ക്യാമറ പ്രകൃതിയെ മാത്രം ക്യാപ്ചർ ചെയ്യുന്നത്. നമ്മളെ വൈറ്റമിൻ ഇങ്ങനെ ദേഹത്തേക്ക് കയറുന്നത് വേറെ ആരും കാണണ്ടല്ലോ.
what can friends and family and neighbours offer to the dying that medical professionals can't?
വെള്ളിപറമ്പിലാണോ? കോഴിക്കോടുണ്ടോ? അല്ല യാത്ര വല്ലതും ആണോ? നമ്മളെ ഗ്രാമത്തിലെ വീടിൻ്റെ ടെറസാണിത്. ഓക്കെ 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 ഓക്കെ, വെരി ഗുഡ്. കുറേ ആയി ഇവിടെ വന്നിട്ട്, എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു ഒരു 2 മാസത്തോളമായി ഇവിടെ വന്നിട്ട്. അപ്പോൾ ജസ്റ്റ് ഇന്നിപ്പോൾ പറമ്പിലൂടെ എല്ലാം ഒന്ന് പോകണം, എല്ലാം ഒന്ന് പോയി കാണണം. മുകളിൽ കുറച്ച് മരം മുറിച്ച സ്ഥലം. ആ റബ്ബറുണ്ട്. നമ്മളെ പുറകിൽ റബ്ബറുണ്ട്. പിന്നെ ഇതിൻ്റെ ബാക്കിൽ കുറേ റബ്ബർ മുറിച്ച സ്ഥലമുണ്ട്. അവിടെ എല്ലാം റീപ്ലാന്റ് ചെയ്യാനായിട്ട് പണിയുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അവിടെ കാട് വെട്ടും കാര്യങ്ങളൊക്കെ നടക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അവിടെ ഒന്ന് പോയി നോക്കണം. ഇനിയിപ്പോൾ എന്തായി സ്ഥിതി, പെരുംകാടാണ്, അതിനകത്തെല്ലാം കാട്ടുപന്നി മൃഗങ്ങളും എല്ലാം ഉണ്ടെന്നാണ് പറഞ്ഞത്. പിന്നെ കഴിഞ്ഞ ദിവസങ്ങളിൽ ഇവിടെ കുറേ, എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു എന്തോ കാട്ടുമൃഗങ്ങളെ അവശിഷ്ടമൊക്കെ പറമ്പിൽ കിടപ്പുണ്ടായിരുന്നു, ചത്തതോ കൊന്നതോ എന്തോ. അതെല്ലാം ഒന്ന് പോയി നോക്കണം. പുറകോട്ട് റബ്ബറാണ്. മുകളിലെ കുളത്തിൽ നിന്നും വരുന്ന വെള്ളം ഇവിടെ മുകളിൽ നമ്മളെ ടെറസിൻ്റെ മുകളിൽ വെള്ളം ചാടുന്നുണ്ട്, അതിൻ്റെ ഒച്ച കേൾക്കുന്നത്. ആ ഉണ്ട്. തണലുണ്ട്, നല്ല തണലുണ്ട്. തണലിനേക്കാൾ കൂടുതൽ എനിക്കിപ്പോൾ എന്നു വെച്ചാൽ വളരെ ഇഷ്ടപ്പെട്ടത് ഈ റബ്ബറിൻ്റെ ഇലയെല്ലാം പൂത്തിട്ട് നല്ല തിളക്കമുണ്ട്. അതിങ്ങനെ നമ്മൾ ഈറിനണിഞ്ഞ് നിൽക്കുക എന്നൊക്കെ പറയാം. ഇലകളെല്ലാം ഈറിനണിഞ്ഞ് നിൽക്കുന്ന വളരെ സുന്ദരമായിട്ടുള്ള, പിന്നെ നല്ല തണുപ്പുണ്ട്. രാവിലെ ഞാൻ ഇന്നലെ ജനലെല്ലാം തുറന്നിട്ടാണ് കിടന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ എന്തൊരു തണുപ്പാണെന്നറിയാം, ഭയങ്കര തണുപ്പ്. 2 പുതപ്പിട്ട് ഇങ്ങനെ പുതച്ച് സുഖമായിട്ട് കിടന്നുറങ്ങി. ടൗണിലൊന്നും നമുക്ക് ആ ഉറക്കം കിട്ടത്തില്ല. ഒരു പക്ഷേ നമ്മൾ റോഡ് സൈഡിൽ നിന്ന് വിട്ടിട്ട് അത്രയും ഒരു ഗ്രാമീണതയൊക്കെ കിട്ടുമായിരിക്കും. പക്ഷേ ഇവിടുത്തെ ഒരു വല്ലാത്തൊരു ഫീലാണ് ഈ ക്ലൈമറ്റിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഫീലേ. ഇറ്റ്സ് ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ റിയലി. പിന്നെ ഈ മരങ്ങളിങ്ങനെ എന്താണ് പുതിയ തളിർപ്പാണ് എല്ലാത്തിലും. തളിർത്തിങ്ങനെ ഒരു വല്ലാണ്ട് എന്തൊക്കെയോ കോസ്മെറ്റിക്സ് ഒക്കെ തേച്ചതുപോലെ ഇങ്ങനെ തിളങ്ങി നിൽക്കുന്നു. റബ്ബറിനൊക്കെ പൂവുണ്ട് ഇപ്പം, നല്ല ഇറ്റ്സ് ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുൾ. ഇവിടെ നിന്ന് ഇറങ്ങിപ്പോകാൻ തോന്നുന്നില്ല. അമ്മ ആരും വിളിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, ചായ ആയി എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞവർ വിളിക്കാൻ വേണ്ടി കുറച്ച് നേരമായി. പോകണം, താഴോട്ട് പോകണം. അതെ, ഈ നമ്മൾ പറഞ്ഞ ഏരിയ ഒക്കെ നല്ല ഭംഗിയുള്ള ഏരിയയാണ്, ബ്യൂട്ടിഫുള്ളാണ്. പിന്നെ ഈ തേങ്ങയെല്ലാം ഇങ്ങനെ വിരിഞ്ഞ് തെങ്ങ് മച്ചിങ്ങയും തേങ്ങയൊക്കെ ആയിട്ട് നിൽക്കുന്നു, നല്ല കാഴ്ചയാണ്. ഇനി കുറച്ച് കഴിയുമ്പോൾ ഞാൻ മുകളിലോട്ട് പോകുന്നുണ്ട്. അവിടെ റീപ്ലാന്റ് ചെയ്യാനായിട്ടുള്ള സ്ഥലത്ത് പണി നടക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. രാവിലെ വന്ന് കാട് വെട്ടുന്നുണ്ട് ആൾക്കാർ. അപ്പോൾ അവിടെ പോകണം. ഇത് കുമ്പളം നിറയെ കുമ്പളങ്ങ ഉണ്ടായി കിടപ്പുണ്ട്. ഇത് നന്നായിട്ട് നമുക്ക് മോരിട്ട് കറി വെക്കാം. പിന്നെ അതുമല്ലെങ്കിൽ എനിക്ക് ഈ കുമ്പളങ്ങ തോരൻ വെച്ചാലും ഭയങ്കര ഇഷ്ടമാണ്, ഉപ്പേരി വെച്ചാലും ഇഷ്ടമാണ്. അതൊരു പുളിയുടെ മുകളിലാണ് കയറി കിടക്കുന്നത്. ഒരു വലിയ പുളിയുണ്ട് ഇവിടെ നമ്മളെ പുറകിൽ. ആ പുളിയുടെ മുകളിൽ വരെ കയറി ഇങ്ങനെ കടന്ന് ഒരു 10-25 എണ്ണം കിടപ്പുണ്ട്. പക്ഷെ അത് പറിക്കാനാണ് ബുദ്ധിമുട്ട്. പക്ഷെ വേറൊരു പ്രോബ്ലം, ചിലപ്പോൾ താഴെ ചാടുമ്പോൾ പൊട്ടി പോവുകയും ചെയ്യും. അത്യാവശ്യം നല്ല വലുപ്പമുള്ള കുമ്പളങ്ങയാണ്. എന്നാലും തോട്ടി കൊണ്ട് പറിക്കാം. നല്ലതാണ് ഇത് കറി വെച്ച് കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ. മോരിട്ട് കറി വെച്ചാൽ നല്ലതാണ്. പിന്നെ തോരൻ കറി വെക്കാം. ചിലപ്പോൾ ഇന്ന് പോരണമെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കുന്നു ആശ്രഫ്. നാളെ വർക്കിംഗ് ഡേ ആണല്ലോ. കോളേജിൽ നാളെ കുറേ പോർഷനൊക്കെ എടുക്കാനുണ്ട്, തീരാനുണ്ട്. ഞാൻ വൈകിട്ട് പോരും, പ്രശ്നം ഉണ്ടാകത്തില്ലായിരിക്കും. നമുക്ക് പിന്നെ പാസ് ID ഉണ്ടല്ലോ, നമുക്ക് പോലീസുകാർ കടത്തി വിടും, പ്രോബ്ലം ഇല്ല. നമ്മൾ അങ്ങോട്ട് പോരും. ഞാൻ വൈകിട്ട് പോരും, വെയിലാറി കഴിയുമ്പോൾ പോരുന്നുണ്ട്. ഇത് വീടിൻ്റെ നമ്മൾ താഴത്തെ ഒരു ഓപ്പൺ ടെറസാണ് ഇത്. അവിടെ കുറേ മരവും സാധനങ്ങളൊക്കെ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട്. ഞാൻ മുകളിലാണ് നിൽക്കുന്നത്. ബൈ, കാണാം. അടുത്ത ദിവസം കാണാം. ഞാനിനി നമ്മുടെ ഇപ്പോഴത്തെ ഈ കോവിഡ് സിറ്റുവേഷനെല്ലാം ഒന്ന് ഇമ്പ്രൂവ് ചെയ്ത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് കുറച്ച് യാത്ര പോകണമെന്നൊക്കെ വിചാരിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും കാണും. Okay, Ashraf. Okay, have a wonderful day. May God bless you. Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Tend to look normal for these patients. And so hopefully this is going to give clues as to both what's happening, but also how to potentially treat long COVID.
Do we know the significance of finding damage? Because, I mean, we already knew about the breathlessness.
Yeah, so the damage that appears to be indicated by these studies is really small amounts of damage, but fairly extensive. And what that means is it would be very hard to detect otherwise, but these smaller insults to the lung, as well as sort of micro clotting, small amounts of clotting of the blood, can really add up into a situation where the patient is experiencing breathlessness, even though it really does look like the lungs are normal. And so hopefully what that allows for is development of treatments that are specifically targeting in these areas of damage, but also trying to prevent them from happening in the first place.
So this is focused on the lungs. Is it possible that this might shed some light onto any other long COVID symptoms?
I think it's a bit early to say it for sure, but fatigue and brain fog are some of the other symptoms that are commonly identified, and certainly those could be related to the poor transfer of oxygen from the lungs into the blood, and potentially that if we can find ways to prevent or repair damage that's occurred, those symptoms could potentially resolve as well.
Okay, thank you, Matt. The researchers will be recruiting 400 patients for the next stage of the study, and we look forward to more results. And in the meantime, Dr. Fraser says there is hope for people who are suffering from long COVID.
When we see people in clinic who are breathless, we can really make progress and we can really set people back on the right track. So not to give up on the rehab, not to get up on the breathing control, not to think, well, actually, I've got lung damage and therefore there's no point in me doing breathing retraining exercises, because people can do well. And actually putting out a message just saying that keep going with the rehab, and whilst you're doing that, we're going to be investigating what biological factors could be driving some of your symptoms.
Dr. Emily Fraser. Now, we've already talked about end-of-life care, and for many, the pandemic has disrupted the process. Over at start-of-life care, the shadow of COVID is also looming. COVID poses a risk to pregnant women and their unborn babies, but among this group, vaccination rates remain low. Be BBC Health correspondent James Gallagher spoke to Dr. Sarah Stock, an honorary consultant and subspecialist in maternal and fetal medicine at the University of Edinburgh, about how big the risk is to pregnant women and their babies.
They're more likely to be admitted to hospital, more likely to be admitted to intensive care, and unfortunately, we know there's an increased chance of being born early, or sadly, babies dying in the womb or dying in the first few weeks of life.
And have you experienced this?
Yes, I mean, it should be a rarity for pregnant women to be in intensive care units, not a regular feature, and our neonatal colleagues are having to deal with very premature babies being delivered because mothers are so sick.
I can imagine that takes an emotional toll.
I think one of the things that I find hard, colleagues find hard, is that the vast number of pregnant women in intensive care, so more than 99% in our study, were unvaccinated.
That is stark.
It is really striking. The babies that we're delivering early, because mothers are unwell, the mothers are unvaccinated. And in our study, in all the babies who died after women had COVID-19 in pregnancy, all of those baby deaths happened in women who were unvaccinated.
That's so sad.
It's really tragic, and what seems particularly difficult is that these deaths could be preventable with vaccination.
Sarah, there's been a lot of discussion about whether there are much lower rates of vaccination in pregnant women. How low is low?
Well, if we think about women giving birth, less than half of them have been vaccinated.
And what's that in comparison to other women of the same age?
It's about 80% of women of the same age have been vaccinated.
Okay, so there is quite the gulf there. Do we have any understanding of where has this hesitancy come from?
One of the main things, I think, is that pregnant women were not included in the original trials of COVID vaccination, and that meant that the initial recommendations on vaccination were a bit woolly, and then they gradually changed over time. But it wasn't really until spring 21 where there was started to be this change from being offered vaccination to being recommended vaccination. And it really wasn't until the end of 2021 itself, so a whole year after the vaccination program started, that pregnant women were a priority group. So that's really helped in sort of bringing the message forward.
But Sarah, we do have a clear picture now of the safety of COVID vaccines in pregnancy, don't we? And in fairness, we actually have for a while. Those early clinical trials, they didn't technically recruit pregnant women, but some female volunteers did end up getting pregnant while they were taking part in the trials.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence. So the first evidence we had was animal studies before the vaccines came out, and then there was this evidence from women who became pregnant when they were participating in trials, and then we've got real-world data. So we've got big studies from America suggesting that vaccines are safe, and our data from UK backs that up as well.
Do you think there's something in the overall messaging that we have around pregnancy as well? That kind of like whole philosophy of not adding anything into the body during a pregnancy, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think that's also there from lots of healthcare providers. They're nervous of recommending things in pregnancy because they perhaps don't think they are confident enough to know whether they should be recommending it or not.
The other one that keeps on coming up, I know somebody who has exactly this concern. They're not pregnant, but they keep on saying, I don't really want the vaccine because it's going to affect my fertility. And that has been completely debunked. But there is that little whiff of evidence around it disrupting menstrual cycles. I mean, you go on social media and that is everywhere.
Yeah, there's loads of misinformation about, but we know there's no effects on fertility. And actually, a recent paper out this week has shown that the effects on periods are very short-lived, if they're at all. So we can be really confident that there is no effect on fertility.
Sarah, if someone is listening right now, they're pregnant, but they haven't been vaccinated yet, what do you say?
I would say no matter what stage in pregnancy you are, or if you're thinking about getting pregnant, get vaccinated just to make sure that you and your baby stay as well as possible during the pregnancy.
Dr. Sarah Stock speaking to my colleague James Gallagher. And Matt, can we end with a study published in PLOS Medicine which finds parents buy fewer sugary drinks when they have health warnings in pictures, not in words. So researchers at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill created this store-like environment in a lab, and they asked 325 parents of children to choose a drink and a snack for their child. The intervention group were offered drinks with picture warnings like those on cigarette packets, while the control group only had barcode labels. Matt, have you seen these pictures? Can you describe them?
I have. Two of the examples that they have provided show a heart that has been damaged by consumption of excess sugar in addition to anything else that it was damaged by, and a foot that has been horribly damaged due to type 2 diabetes. So they're pretty concerning.
A blackened foot on your chocolate bar.
Exactly.
Is this going to pave the way for chocolate bar wrappers plastered in gruesome images of blocked arteries and fat-covered organs? Because that's really going to ruin the chocolate bar for me.
It's going to ruin it for me, too. I'm not sure whether we're going to go in that direction, because I think people have, we know that these kind of warnings have worked well for things like cigarettes, but I'm not sure that people are necessarily going to like them as much when they're on things that we are used to consuming in daily life, like chocolate or drinks. On the other hand, the effects that they found in the study were quite large. So they found about a 17% percentage point difference in purchase of these sugary drinks. And, that potentially could have an impact if this were demonstrated to be replicable across, a country. It could have a real impact. So I think it's unclear.
They could just make chocolate bars less delicious.
Yeah, I don't think I'd be in favor of that.
I'm not in favor of that. And somehow I'm not in favor of any of these options.
It's a difficult one, right? So much of when we think about things that would improve our health require us to moderate or move away from things that we enjoy. And so we really do have to think very carefully about how we think about moderation just as much as we think about abstinence.
Thank you very much to my guest, Dr. Matt Fox, and thank you to producers Paula McGrath and Samara Linton. I'm Marnie Chesterton. You can find me on Twitter at Amsterdam. I'll be back at the same time next week. Bye for now.
This is the BBC World Service, and on the inquiry this week, the demand for lithium is soaring. The metal is a vital element in electric car batteries and other green energy, but it's only being mined in a few areas of the world. This week in the inquiry, we're asking, do we have enough lithium to power the future? The inquiry at bbcworldservice.com/inquiry. And in an hour, from our own correspondent,
we meet some of the fighters against Myanmar's military rule. The travelling salesman and a guy from the ice cream parlour, learning to shoot and hide in the forest while dreaming of home. How the country's brief experiment with democracy is keeping that dream alive.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Coming up, it's World Book Club with me, Harriet Gilbert. And this month, the second in our season celebrating the exuberance of youth in this, the BBC's centenary year, we're talking with the world-famous Chilean author Isabel Allende about her wonderful novel, Eva Luna. Eva Luna is the tale of an orphan who beguiles the world with her imaginative stories, triumphing over adversities and bringing light, as her name would suggest, to a dark place. As Eva grows into womanhood, Isabel Allende conjures up a whole complex, unidentified Latin American nation, peopled by a cast of unforgettable characters, rich, poor, simple, sophisticated, oppressors and oppressed, and revolutionaries. Against this turbulent background, love, politics and tragedy all play a part in Eva's life and help shape her into the unforgettable storyteller she becomes. Join us after the news for World Book Club with Isabel Allende and a novel celebrating the power of imagination to create a better world.
Hello, this is Danielle Yawowiecka with the BBC News. A 5-year-old Rocco who fell down a well on Tuesday died. Rayan was recovered from the 30-metre deep well after a huge rescue effort that attracted global attention. Caroline Hawley reports.
In a remote corner of Morocco, under the glare of the world's cameras, exhausted rescuers had worked day and night to reach Rayan. Rescuers couldn't get down to him, so in a painstaking and dangerous operation, they dug horizontally through a hillside, risking landslides as they built a tunnel towards him. A camera they'd lowered down on a cable had initially showed him covered in earth, injured but alive. But the rescuers knew it was a race against time. Shortly after they carried his body out to a waiting ambulance, King Mohammed of Morocco called the 5-year-old's parents to offer his condolences.
Madagascar has been hit by a powerful storm for the second time in weeks, with forecasters warning of the likelihood of significant and widespread damage. Cyclone Batsirai has brought heavy rain and sustained winds of nearly 170 kilometres an hour. More from our Africa editor, Will Ross.
The government as well as aid agencies have set up shelters so that if people are living in areas that are at risk, and they're mainly low-lying areas, and some of these communities that will have been hit are very close to the sea and low-lying, they've been encouraged to seek shelter in places that have been set up where there's right out the storm.
Authorities in Mexican state of Zacatecas are investigating the murder of 16 people, as deaths are thought to be linked to an intensifying struggle between drugs and gangs. 10 of the bodies were found dumped in the street in the city of Fresnillo, with messages attached to them. A battle for control of the area is raging between two cartels, Jalisco New Generation and Sinaloa. You're listening to the World News from the BBC. Reports from the United States say security officials have warned that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could cause as many as 50,000 civilian deaths. Politicians in Washington were briefed on the latest US intelligence this week by senior members of the Biden administration.
Canada has seen another weekend of large protests against COVID measures, with thousands of people taking part. Many joined an encampment in the centre of the capital, Ottawa, which has been gridlocked for days. In Toronto, lorries were used to block a major intersection. This truck driver explained why he joined the protest.
People should be able to make their own choice to take the needle or not take the needle, and not lose the job, not lose their house, not lose their income, just for the vaccination.
Queen Elizabeth has said it's her sincere wish that Prince Charles's wife, Camilla, be known as Queen Consort once he takes the British throne. The Queen's wishes were part of her Platinum Jubilee message, issued ahead of the 70th anniversary of her accession on Sunday. Here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Whittle.
It indicates not least that the Queen is now thinking about what happens after the end of her reign, and of course it settles one of the big unresolved issues about Charles's reign. What will Camilla be known as? Now, the Queen is careful in her choice of words. My sincere wish, she says, strictly speaking, it should be for the Prime Minister of the day to advise on something such as this. But who is going to argue now that the Queen has said this? Charles, of course, will be delighted. He has wanted this ever since he and Camilla married.
The Tunisian President Kais Saied has moved to dissolve the country's Supreme Judicial Council. In a late-night statement, he said the council should consider itself a thing of the past. He gave no further details. President Saied has ruled by decree since he sacked the government and suspended Parliament last July, prompting complaints of a coup. BBC News.
Hello, this is the BBC World Service. I'm Harriet Gilbert. Welcome to World Book Club. This year, as the BBC marks its 100th anniversary, we're celebrating the exuberance of youth. And this month, we've been reading a novel about an irrepressible young orphan whose gift for inventive storytelling helps her survive in an often dangerous world. The book is called Eva Luna, and here to answer questions about it from BBC listeners around the world is its internationally best-selling author, the Chilean Isabel Allende. Isabel, a big welcome to World Book Club.
Thank you. I am really honored and happy to be here.
Well, I should have actually said welcome back, because it's very rare that we have a guest twice. We've had the Nigerian Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka has been twice on World Book Club, but now you, because We spoke in 2003, you spoke about the House of the Spirits, and I was just thinking you'd published 13 books, I think it was then. And I've been counting up, and you've now published 26, I think, including your most recent novel, Your Letter. And I just don't know how you do it. I mean, do you just get up every day, go to your desk, sit down and write until nightfall?
Harriet, this is my job. This is my day job. So I do get up early and I write several hours a day, but I'm not fanatic anymore. I'm just full of stories. My mind is like bursting with stories, so I have no problem writing them. I just have to type them.
Well, if Isabel Allende's output is impressive, which it is, what's even more impressive is how loved she is around the world. Her books have been translated into 42 languages, showered with awards in the USA, Latin America, and Europe, and between them they've sold more than 75 million copies. Eva Luna, Isabel's fourth novel, is the story of a girl who, becoming an orphan at the age of 6, is hired out to work as a servant by her religiously devout, if somewhat alcoholic, godmother. Her employers range from the eccentric to the cruel, and on the run from one of them, Eva meets up with a savvy street urchin called Uberto, who finds her somewhere to live in a brothel. But then, one day, the brothel's raided, and Eva's on the move again, making new friends, making new enemies, tumbling into trouble and clambering out, enchanting her with her storytelling, while all around her the country, an unnamed country in Latin America, bubbles with revolution and repression. And, of course, all the while, Eva's growing up, becoming more politically aware and more sexually attractive. But, Isabel Allende, would you start off by reading from the very beginning of Eva Luna in the English translation by Margaret Sayers Peden?
Yes. My name is Eva, which means life, according to a book of names my mother consulted. I was born in the back room of a shadowy house and grew up amidst ancient furniture, books in Latin, and human mummies. But none of those things made me melancholic, because I came into the world with a breath of jungle in my memory. My father, an Indian with yellow eyes, came from the place where the 100 rivers meet. He smelled of lush, growing things, and he never looked directly at the sky because he had grown up beneath a canopy of trees, and light seemed indecent to him. Consuelo, my mother, spent her childhood in an enchanted region where for centuries adventurers have searched for the city of pure gold that conquistadors saw when they peered into the abyss of their own ambition. She was marked forever by the landscape, and in some way she managed to pass that sign on to me.
Isabel Allende, thank you very much. And let's go to your first reader with a question. He is Daniel Goulart. He is in Bologna in Italy, and he rang this into BBC World Book Club earlier.
Hello, Isabel. This is Daniel Goulart calling from Bologna, Italy. Here's my question. What were you trying to achieve at your very first paragraph of Eva Luna? Thank you very much.
Well, there's a question for you. I mean, the first paragraph of any novel is always very important. What were you trying to achieve with this one?
I just needed to open a door for the story and for the protagonist. I had collected a bunch of anecdotes and wonderful, fantastic events that happened in Venezuela, where I was living in exile. And I would cut clippings from newspapers and just collect them. So there was a bunch of stories that I wanted to tell, and I thought I will sort of link them with the voice of the storyteller who tells the stories. And that person would be Eva Luna. The character of Eva Luna is based on a primitive artist in Venezuela called Elsa Morales, who unfortunately died, and she was a friend and an extraordinary artist, an extraordinary woman in Venezuela who had a hard life and an incredible imagination. So it was easy to write the book thinking of her. But she told me some of those anecdotes as well. Like Eva, she was an orphan very young, and she went from one house to the other as a servant. And her life was very adventurous and terrible also. So I had a lot of material to start with, but I didn't know how the story would develop. I never know. The first few sentences give the tone to the book.
Well, thank you very much for that, Isabel. And we've got a question now from Argentina, where Milares rang in this question for you.
Hi Isabel, my name is Milagros and I'm 25 years old. I am a reader of you from Argentina. In your books in general, I noticed that you make constant references to the mother-daughter and mother-son bond, even when they are not blood related. In Eva Luna, both Elvira and the godmother, for instance, have a maternal role. So does the madam, even if it is a brief and passing one. I would like to know the reason for this and if it has something to do with the role that mothers have in the Latin American culture. Thank you very much.
So, Isabel, it's true, there are, I think, at least 3 surrogate mothers in Eva's life. Her own mother dies, then there's her religious rum-drinking godmother. There's the cook Elvira, who likes to sleep in her coffin, and then there's the madame who runs the brothel. And Milares wants to know why, is this anything to do with the role that mothers have played in Latin American culture?
For me, family is important, and I don't think that the family necessarily has to be blood related. Sometimes other people take the role of the parent or the sibling. In my case, my father abandoned the family when I was barely 3 years old, and I had other people like my grandfather and later my stepfather who took up the role of the father. However, in my writing, I don't have any fathers, any loving, present fathers. They're always absent, or they have died, or they are so authoritarian that they don't really have a relationship with the son or the daughter. But mothers are essential. And so I have real mothers and substitute mothers when the real mother is not available. And in the case of Eva, as you said, there are successive mothers that take up that role. And Eva, who needs a family, puts a family together also with a character that later appears, a transsexual called Melesio, and other people that become her family. I think I have an obsession with the idea of the extended family that unfortunately I don't have, because I lost it when I left my country and I went into exile in the 70s.
Oh, that's sad. That's sad. Well, talking of mothers, we have a question now about Eva's birth mother, Consuelo, who we've heard about just at the beginning of the novel, but who disappears quite soon. This was emailed to BBC World Book Club by Suad Sharabani, who's an Iraqi-Canadian living in Toronto. And Suad writes this, she says, "I love this book." And then she asks, "Do you agree that Eva Luna's mother was a remarkable person? Because although she suffered so much, yet her love was pure and she did not hold any bitterness, resentment or anger against anyone." I mean, it's clear that Suad thinks that Eva's mother was pretty terrific. Do you agree with her?
Yes, I think that she's a lovely character because she's incapable of bad feelings, hatred, rancor, any of that. And she gives Eva the gift of storytelling and gives her the gift of imagining a better world where she can inhabit and escape from the misery in which she's really living. So it's unfortunate that she died so soon, but I needed to kill her in order to keep the story moving. I'm so sorry.
I was about to say she didn't have to die. You could have kept her alive.
Unfortunately, sometimes you just have to kill people.
And I notice, incidentally, that the novel is dedicated to your own mother.
Mm-hmm. I had an incredible mother, but she was not at all like Eva Luna's mother, like Consuelo. I had a great relationship with her that lasted all our lives. She died at 98, shortly before the pandemic. And although we were separated most of our lives, we would write to each other every single day. And I have collected thousands of letters from my mother.
No wonder you dedicated the book to her. Well, your next question, Isabel. This one comes from Trinidad and Tobago, Kim De Silva. Kim, hello.
Hello, I wanted to know, Mimi, that is one of my absolute favourite characters.
and she is easily accepted by Eva, and I think she's one of the most beautiful souls depicted in the novel. And reading about a character like Mimi in the 2000s, it would seem almost normalized.
ഗുഡ് മോർണിംഗ് ഗുഡ് മോർണിംഗ് ഗുഡ് മോർണിംഗ് മാം ഗുഡ് മോർണിംഗ്. ഞാനിവിടെ ഗ്രാമത്തിലാണ്. ഗ്രാമത്തിൽ വീട്ടിൽ വന്നതാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ജസ്റ്റ് എൻജോയിങ് ദി മോർണിംഗ് ഇൻ ദി sun. The very tender soft rays of the sun is here, and I'm having some vitamin D on my terrace, listening to the news, rather enjoying the book club discussion in BBC, and just having some sun bath. Wish you a very wonderful day. Thank you for your message. Thank you very much.
It's true, it was the 80s. My daughter Paula was studying psychology, and she decided to specialize in human sexuality. This was in Venezuela a long time ago, where nobody talked about transsexuals or changing your gender. It was almost
Thank you for the like. Thank you. I'll come back to your channel. Thank you.
Very interested, and she got to meet a few transsexuals, even people who had had all the surgery to become the other gender, and interviewed them for her studies. And so I got to know them and got to talk to them about the psychological and the physical trauma and the rejection and the hatred they had to confront, and how they had to be hiding most of the time. So the character of Melesio was really based on people I got to know because of my daughter. It was, as you said, not accepted at the time. Now, of course, it doesn't have, it's not even original. But then, it was pretty rare to talk about it at least.
നാട്ടിലിവിടെ തോട്ടുമുക്കം എന്ന് പറയും. തോട്ടുമുക്കം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾ മലപ്പുറം ജില്ലയുടെയും കോഴിക്കോട് ജില്ലയുടെയും കൂടെ അതിരാണ്. ഇവിടെ അരീക്കോട്, പിന്നെ മുക്കം, അരീക്കോട് മുക്കം ആണ് അറിയപ്പെടുന്ന ചെറിയ ടൗണുകൾ. അതിനൊക്കെ നമുക്ക് ഒരു ചെറിയ പുഴകളുണ്ട്. അതായത് കക്കാടംപൊയിലിൽ നിന്ന് ഒഴുകുന്ന ഒരു പുഴയുണ്ട്, വെറ്റിലപ്പാറയിൽ നിന്ന് വരുന്ന ഒരു പുഴയുണ്ട്. ആ പുഴയുടെ രണ്ടിൻ്റെയും കൂടെ സംഗമ സ്ഥാനത്തുള്ള ഒരു ഗ്രാമമാണ് തോട്ടുമുക്കം. അവിടെയാണ്. നല്ല രസമാണ്. ഇവിടെ ചെറിയ തണുപ്പൊക്കെ ഉണ്ട്. പിന്നെ മരങ്ങളെല്ലാം ഇങ്ങനെ തളിർത്ത് നിൽക്കുന്നു. ഇപ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ നോക്കുവാണെങ്കിൽ കാണാം, എൻ്റെ വീടിൻ്റെ പുറകിൽ നല്ലൊരു വലിയ വാളംപുളിയുണ്ട്. ആ വാളംപുളി നിറയെ കുമ്പളങ്ങ ഇങ്ങനെ കായ്ച്ചു കിടപ്പുണ്ട്. 10-25 കുമ്പളങ്ങയെങ്കിലും ഉണ്ടാവും ഇപ്പോൾ. എനിക്ക് കുമ്പളങ്ങക്കറിയൊക്കെ ഭയങ്കര ഇഷ്ടമാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഇത് എല്ലാം ഒന്നും നമുക്ക് ഉപയോഗിക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല, കുറേയെല്ലാം ചാടിപ്പോകുക. പിന്നെ ഇത് പറിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് പോയി വിൽക്കുക എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ വലിയ മെനക്കേട. പണിക്കാർക്ക് കൂലി കൊടുക്കാനുള്ള പൈസ പോലും കിട്ടിയല്ലോ. പക്ഷേ എങ്കിലും ഇത് കാണുമ്പോൾ രസമാണ്. നിറയെ കുമ്പളങ്ങ ഉണ്ടായി കിടക്കുന്നു. നല്ല കുമ്പളം, നല്ല മുഴുത്ത കുമ്പളങ്ങയാണ്. ഒരെണ്ണം പറിച്ചു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ നമുക്കൊരു 3-4 കറിക്കുള്ള വകുപ്പുണ്ട്. നല്ല ഗ്രാമമാണ്. ഗ്രാമം ശരിക്കും നാട്ടിൻപുറം നന്മകളാൽ സമൃദ്ധം. ഗ്രാമം നന്മകളാൽ സമൃദ്ധമാണ്. നമുക്ക് ഒന്നും വാങ്ങി വെച്ചിട്ടില്ലെങ്കിലും ഇവിടെയുള്ള പറമ്പിൽ നിന്നുള്ള സാധനങ്ങൾ കൊണ്ടൊക്കെ നമുക്ക് കഴിഞ്ഞു പോകാനായിട്ട് കഴിയും. പക്ഷേ ഒരു പ്രോബ്ലം ഇപ്പോൾ എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ വല്ലാണ്ട് കാട്ടുമൃഗങ്ങളുടെ ആക്രമണമുണ്ട്, ഈ കാട്ടുപന്നി മുതലായിട്ടുള്ള സാധനങ്ങൾ. അപ്പോൾ അതുകൊണ്ട് നമുക്ക് കിഴങ്ങ് വർഗ്ഗങ്ങൾ അങ്ങനെയുള്ള സംഭവങ്ങളൊന്നും നമുക്കിപ്പോൾ ഉണ്ടാക്കാനായിട്ട് കഴിയില്ല. കപ്പ, ചേന, ചേമ്പ്, കാച്ചിൽ ഇങ്ങനെയുള്ള സംഭവങ്ങളെല്ലാം ഈ കാട്ടുമൃഗങ്ങൾ വന്ന് നശിപ്പിച്ച് കളയും. അല്ലായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ നല്ല ഒരു കൊറോണനെയോ ലോക്ക്ഡൗണിനെയോ ഒന്നും പേടിക്കാതെ തന്നെ നാട്ടിൻപുറത്ത് നിന്ന് തന്നെ നമുക്ക് സുഖമായിട്ട് ജീവിക്കാമായിരുന്നു. പക്ഷേ എങ്കിലും ഇപ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് ചക്കയെല്ലാം ഉണ്ട്. ചക്കയെല്ലാം നന്നായി ഉണ്ടായി വരുന്നുണ്ട്. അമ്മ രാവിലെ പറയുക, എടാ നമ്മുടെ പ്ലാവിലെല്ലാം ചെറിയ ചക്ക വിരിയുന്നുണ്ട് എന്ന് പറയുക. അപ്പോൾ ഇന്നിപ്പോൾ ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഉച്ചയ്ക്ക് ഇടിഞ്ചക്കയുടെ ഒരു തോരൻ ഉണ്ടാകും. ഇഷ്ടമാണ് ഇടിഞ്ചക്ക തോരൻ, നല്ലതാണ്. നമ്മളിവിടെ പുറകിൽ എനിക്ക് ഈ പറമ്പിൽ മൊത്തം ഒരു 6-7 പ്ലാവുണ്ട്. നല്ല പ്ലാവാണ് അത്. ചിലതിൻ്റെ ചക്കയെല്ലാം നല്ലതാണ്, ചിലതിൻ്റെ ചുള ഒക്കെ ചെറുതായിരിക്കും. അപ്പോൾ അതൊന്നും നമ്മൾ എടുക്കില്ല, കുഞ്ഞി കട്ടിയില്ലാത്ത തുളയൊക്കെ ആകുമ്പോൾ. പക്ഷേ ഈ ചക്കക്കാലം വലിയൊരു രസമാണ്. എനിക്ക് ചക്കപ്പഴം ഇഷ്ടമാണ്, ചക്കപ്പുഴുക്ക് ഇഷ്ടമാണ്, ഇടിഞ്ചക്ക ഇഷ്ടമാണ്. പിന്നെ ചക്ക നമ്മൾ വെളിച്ചെണ്ണയിൽ വറുത്തെടുത്താൽ ഇഷ്ടമാണ്. ഇറ്റ്സ് ക്വൈറ്റ് വണ്ടർഫുൾ. പക്ഷേ ഗ്രാമത്തിൽ പലപ്പോഴും വരാൻ പറ്റുന്നില്ല, അതാണ് പ്രശ്നം. നമ്മൾ ജോലി, പിന്നെ പല ട്രെയിനിങ് പ്രോഗ്രാംസ് കാര്യങ്ങളെല്ലാം കാരണം പലപ്പോഴും നഗരത്തിൽ പെട്ടുപോവുകയാണ്. നഗരത്തിൽ പെട്ടുപോകുമ്പോൾ നമ്മൾ അവിടെയുള്ള സാധനങ്ങളെല്ലാം ഡിപ്പെൻഡ് ചെയ്യും. മാർക്കറ്റിൽ പോയി മേടിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് വരും. പച്ചക്കറിയും അതുപോലെ കിഴങ്ങ് വർഗ്ഗങ്ങളൊക്കെ കഴിക്കാൻ ആഗ്രഹത്തിന് അവിടെ നിന്ന് മേടിക്കും. അവിടെ നിന്ന് മേടിക്കുമ്പോൾ പലപ്പോഴും നമുക്ക് നല്ലത് കിട്ടത്തില്ല. കാരണം മാർക്കറ്റിൽ വിൽക്കാനായിട്ട് താങ്ക് യു. ചക്ക എനിക്കും ഭയങ്കര ഇഷ്ടമാണ്. നമ്മൾ വിൽക്കാനായിട്ട് ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്ന സാധനങ്ങളിലെല്ലാം കീടനാശിനികളും അതുപോലെ രാസവളമെല്ലാം കണ്ടമാനം ചേർക്കുമല്ലോ. പക്ഷെ ഞാൻ പറയട്ടെ, നമുക്കായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ കൃഷി ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ ഒന്നും ചേർക്കാറില്ല. ഈ പറഞ്ഞ ചാരവും ചവറും പിന്നെ നമ്മളെ വീട്ടിൽ നിന്നും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മുടെ തൊടിയിൽ നിന്നും ജൈവവളങ്ങൾ തന്നെയാണ് നമ്മൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കാറുള്ളത് കൃഷിക്കായിട്ട്, കപ്പയ്ക്കായിട്ട് എന്തിനായാലും. അല്ലാതെ രാസവളങ്ങൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കില്ല. പക്ഷെ മാർക്കറ്റിൽ കിട്ടുന്ന ചേന, ചേമ്പ്, കാച്ചിക്ക ഒക്കെ എല്ലാം ഈ പറഞ്ഞ വളവും ഒക്കെ ഇട്ടിട്ട് ഉണ്ടാക്കുന്നതായിരിക്കും. എന്നാലും എങ്ങനെയൊക്കെ ആയാലും ഗ്രാമം നന്മകളാൽ സമൃദ്ധം തന്നെയാണ്, ഒരു ഡൗട്ടുമില്ല. ശുദ്ധമായ വായു, വളരെ ശുദ്ധമായിട്ടുള്ള വായു, നല്ല കാലാവസ്ഥ, ഫാൻ പോലും വേണ്ട നമുക്ക്, എ സിയോ ഫാനോ ഒന്നും വേണ്ട, സുഖമായിട്ട് കിടന്ന്. ഇന്നലെ രാത്രി അടുത്ത കാലത്തെങ്കിലും ഇതുപോലെ സുന്ദരമായിട്ട് ഉറങ്ങിയിട്ടില്ല. നല്ല തണുപ്പ്, വെളുപ്പാതിര കഴിഞ്ഞപ്പോഴത്തേക്കും നല്ല തണുപ്പായി. 2 പുതപ്പൊക്കെ പുതച്ചു മൂടി, ജനലെല്ലാം തുറന്നിട്ട്, ഒന്നും പേടിക്കാനില്ല. ഒരു കള്ളനും വരികയില്ല, ഒരു ഉപദ്രവം ഉണ്ടാകത്തില്ല. കാരണം അത്രയ്ക്കും സേഫാണ് നമ്മളെ ഏരിയ. പിന്നെ നാട്ടിൻപുറത്തെ പോലെ 3 സെൻറ്റിലും 4 സെൻറ്റിലും ഒന്നും അല്ലല്ലോ ഇവിടെ. 4 സെൻറ്റിലും 5 സെൻറ്റിലും ഒന്നും അല്ലല്ലോ നമ്മൾ ഗ്രാമങ്ങളിലെ വീടുകളൊക്കെ. ഗ്രാമങ്ങളിലെ വീടുകൾ എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ വിശാലമായിട്ടുള്ള പറമ്പിലുള്ള പെരയാണല്ലോ. അപ്പോൾ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും നമുക്ക് ഒന്നും പേടിക്കണം. നമ്മുടെ കോമ്പൗണ്ടിൽ നോർമലി ആരും കയറത്തില്ല. പിന്നെ ഇവിടെ എല്ലാം ഓരോ വീട്ടുകാരും അവർ പരസ്പരം അറിയാവുന്ന കാരണം എല്ലാവരും എന്ത് ആവശ്യമുണ്ടെങ്കിലും വരും. പിന്നെ വളരെ ജാഗ്രതയോട് കൂടിയാണ് എല്ലാവരും ഇരിക്കുക. അപ്പോൾ ഒരിക്കലും നമുക്കൊരു അപകടത്തിൻ്റെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു മോഷ്ടാക്കളുടെ ആക്രമണം അങ്ങനെയൊന്നും ഉണ്ടാകത്തില്ല. അപ്പോൾ ഇന്നലെ സുന്ദരമായിട്ട് നല്ല ക്ലൈമറ്റാണ്, വളരെ നല്ല ക്ലൈമറ്റാണ്. തണുപ്പ്, പിന്നെ ശുദ്ധവായു, അതാണ് ഏറ്റവും പ്രധാനം. നമ്മൾ ബ്രീതിങ് എക്സസൈസ് ഒക്കെ ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ, നഗരത്തിൽ ബ്രീതിങ് എക്സസൈസ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ പലപ്പോഴും മലിനമായിട്ടുള്ള എയർ ആയിരിക്കും നമ്മൾ ശ്വസിച്ചെടുക്കുക. പക്ഷേ ഇവിടെ വന്നിട്ട് വേണം, നാട്ടിൻപുറങ്ങളിൽ വന്നിട്ട് കെട്ടിട സമുച്ചയങ്ങളും അതുപോലെ ഫാക്ടറികളും കമ്പനികളും മറ്റേ ഹോട്ടലുകളും ഒന്നും ഇല്ലാത്ത സ്ഥലത്ത് വന്ന് ശുദ്ധമായ വായു ബ്രീതിങ് എക്സസൈസ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ നമുക്ക് ശരീരത്തിന് അതുകൊണ്ട് ഗുണമുണ്ടാകും. അപ്പോൾ ഇവിടെ വന്നിട്ട് ഞാൻ രാവിലെ കുറച്ച് വെയിലൊക്കെ കൊണ്ട് കുറച്ച് ബ്രീതിങ് എക്സസൈസ് ചെയ്ത് ഇങ്ങനെ ന്യൂസൊക്കെ കേട്ട് ഇങ്ങനെ ഇരിക്കുന്നു. നമുക്ക് പക്ഷികളുടെ പാട്ടും കാക്കകളുടെ എനിക്കൊന്നും ഇല്ലെന്നുള്ള വിളിയും ഒക്കെ കേൾക്കാൻ കഴിയുന്നുണ്ട്. സുന്ദരമായിട്ടുള്ള, ശരിക്കും പലപ്പോഴും നാട്ടിൻപുറത്തൊക്കെ വന്ന് ഇങ്ങനെ പ്രകൃതിയുടെ ആ ഭംഗി കാണുമ്പോഴും അതുപോലെ കിളികളുടെയും പക്ഷിക്കൂട്ടങ്ങളുടെ എല്ലാം, കിളികൾ എന്ന് ഉദ്ദേശിക്കുന്ന കുഞ്ഞു കിളികളാണ്, അതൊക്കെ കാണാൻ ഇവിടെ നമുക്ക്. ഇതൊക്കെ കാണുമ്പോൾ ലൈഫിന് ഒരു മീനിങ് വന്ന പോലെ തോന്നുന്നു. ഇവരും നമ്മളെ സഹോദരങ്ങളാണല്ലോ, നമ്മളോട് ഇവരെല്ലാവരും ഓരോ ഗ്രീറ്റിങ്സ് പറയുന്നുണ്ടല്ലോ എന്ന് കേൾക്കുമ്പോൾ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ഈ ബാലസൂര്യൻ്റെ നല്ല സ്നേഹമുള്ള കിരണങ്ങൾ നമ്മളെ ശരീരത്ത് പതിക്കുമ്പോൾ ആരെയും പേടിക്കാതെ നമുക്ക് ബീച്ചിലൊന്നും പോയി സൺബാത്ത് ചെയ്യണ്ട. ഇവിടെ തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ പറമ്പിൽ, നമ്മളുടെ തൊടിയിൽ, നമ്മളുടെ വീടിലെ മുറ്റത്ത് നിന്ന് നമുക്ക് സൂര്യപ്രകാശം കൊള്ളാം. സുന്ദരം. പക്ഷേ നമുക്ക് ഗ്രാമങ്ങളും നാട്ടിൻപുറങ്ങളും ഒക്കെ വലിയ വലിയ മാഫിയകൾ വന്ന് തീർന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണല്ലോ. അതൊരു വലിയൊരു വിഷമമുണ്ടാക്കുന്ന യാഥാർത്ഥ്യമാണ്. പക്ഷേ അംഗീകരിക്കുക അല്ലാതെ നിവൃത്തിയില്ലല്ലോ. അപ്പോൾ ഓരോരുത്തർക്കും തീരുമാനിക്കാം. ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ കയ്യിലുള്ള കുഞ്ഞ് തൊടി വിറ്റ് കളയില്ല, നശിപ്പിക്കില്ല, ഇത് ഞാനിങ്ങനെ തലമുറകളായി സൂക്ഷിച്ചു പോകും എന്ന് വിചാരിക്കുക. ഇതിപ്പോൾ പലരും സാമ്പത്തികമായിട്ടുള്ള ആവശ്യം വരുമ്പോൾ 1/2 ഏക്കറോ 1 ഏക്കറോ 2 ഏക്കറോ ഉള്ളത് വിറ്റിട്ട് ആ പൈസ കൊണ്ട് എൻജോയ് ചെയ്യാൻ നോക്കും. അങ്ങനെ വരുമ്പോഴത്തേക്കും ഗ്രാമങ്ങളും നാട്ടിൻപുറങ്ങളും ഒക്കെ നമുക്ക് നഷ്ടപ്പെടും. വ്യാവസായിക ആവശ്യങ്ങൾക്കായിട്ടും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ മറ്റ് ആവശ്യങ്ങൾക്കൊക്കെ ആയിട്ട് ശുദ്ധമായിട്ടുള്ള നാട്ടിൻപുറത്തെ നദികളും പുഴകളും വൃക്ഷലതാദികളും എല്ലാം നശിപ്പിക്കപ്പെടുന്നു. താങ്ക് യു ഓൾ ഫോർ ബീയിങ് വിത്ത് മീ. ഹാവ് എ വണ്ടർഫുൾ ഡേ. നല്ലൊരു ദിവസം ആശംസിക്കുന്നു. നല്ല ആരോഗ്യമുണ്ടാകട്ടെ, നന്മകളുണ്ടാകട്ടെ, പ്രതീക്ഷകളൊക്കെ സഫലമാകട്ടെ. ദൈവം അനുഗ്രഹിക്കട്ടെ. താങ്ക് യു. ഐ വിൽ കം ബാക്ക് ടു യുവർ ചാനൽ. തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും വരാം, തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും. സഹകരണം ഉറപ്പാക്കുന്നു.
In the skirmishes with the army, he watched men die whom he had shared a cigarette with the night before. He would lean over them with a camera and film them from somewhere outside himself, as if he were a long way away, looking at their bodies through a telescope. I must hang on to my sanity, he kept repeating, as he had done often in similar situations.
Isabel Allende, thank you very much indeed. And on the telephone now from Merced in California in the United States, it's Emily Moran. Emily, hello.
Hello.
You've got a question for Isabel.
Yes. Having reread House of the Spirits last year, I was thinking about political cycles of history and was curious about your thoughts on kind of those historical cycles in general.
So your thoughts on historical cycles, Isabel Allende, as in this novel, the move from repressive dictatorships to democracy to rebellion, do they go round in circles or do you see progress?
Well, The House of the Spirits and this novel, Eva Luna, and also Violeta, my recent novel that will be published this week, they deal with a period in South America, in Latin America, that was politically full of conflict. We had all kinds of stuff. We had democracy that was turned over to a dictatorship in many countries, a very repressive right-wing military coups propped up by the CIA. It was the time of the Cold War. In Central America, genocide against the native peoples and against the poor, also by the military, trained in the United States. So we lived all that during decades in Latin America. And then when those periods of awful dictatorships sort of ended naturally, they were replaced by very fragile democracies, in some cases very corrupt, and that is the case in Eva Luna. The place where the House of the Spirits and Violeta take place is the southern cone of the continent. It could be Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Peru. But this novel, Eva Luna, is a very tropical story. It happens in the heat of the Caribbean. So that could have happened in some places in Colombia, in Venezuela, in some other tropical countries.
Emily, thank you very much indeed for your question. Isabel Allende, thank you. We've got loads more questions for you about Eva Luna. But first, a quick pause for the news, and to remind you that there's an archive of well over 200 World Book Club interviews you can access via our website. Back shortly, the news after this.
This is the BBC World Service.
We live at the boundary of what is known and what is unknown, and we push that boundary forward.
Science. It explains the world around us. You have to go back 3 million years to find the last time CO2 concentrations were similar to what they are today. And what happens to us.
How exactly could a yawn make our brains cooler? Yawning increases blood flow to the skull, and it could modify the temperature or cool that blood flow through countercurrent heat exchange with the ambient air and introducing cooler blood from the lungs and extremities.
It's fascinating, wonderful, and confusing all at the same time.
If I was to put a spoonful of dark matter in your hand, you would feel the weight of it. You would feel the gravitational pull between the dark matter and Earth. But when you look down at your hands, you would just see your hands. That's really cool.
Science on the BBC World Service.
Coming up, it's World Book Club with me, Harriet Gilbert, the second in our year-long series celebrating the exuberance of youth. And this month, we're talking with the Chilean author Isabel Allende about her dazzling novel, Eva Luna. An orphan growing up in the political turmoil of a Latin American state, Eva Luna beguiles the world with her extraordinary stories in a novel that celebrates the power of the imagination to create a better world. That's World Book Club with Isabel Allende after the news.
BBC News with Danielle Yawowiecka. Reports from the United States say security officials have warned that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could cause as many as 50,000 civilian deaths. Politicians were briefed on the latest US intelligence this week. They were reportedly told Russia had amassed 70% of the forces needed for a full-scale invasion. King Mohammed of Morocco has offered his condolences to the parents of a boy who died after falling down a well on Tuesday. Rayan was pulled from the 30-metre deep well on Saturday after a huge rescue effort that attracted global attention. His death was confirmed a short time later. Madagascar has been hit by a powerful storm for the second time in weeks, with forecasters warning of the likelihood of significant and widespread damage. Cyclone Batsurai has brought heavy rain and fierce winds. The Peruvian authorities have allowed the Spanish firm Repsol to reopen a refinery that closed after a big oil spill. The facility provides much of Peru's petrol and diesel. Its closure had led to queues at petrol stations. The Tunisian president, Kais Saied, has moved to dissolve the country's Supreme Judicial Council. Mr. Saied said the council should consider itself a thing of the past. He has ruled by a decree since he sacked the government last July. Critics have accused him of staging a coup. Queen Elizabeth says she wants Prince Charles's wife Camilla to be known as Queen Consort when her son eventually takes the throne. The Queen's wish was part of a message marking the 70th anniversary of her accession. She thanked people in Britain and worldwide for their loyalty and affection. And one of Mexico's best-known songwriters, Rubén Fuentes, has died. He was 95. A talented violinist, composer and producer, Fuentes transformed traditional mariachi music. He became a household name in Mexico when he joined a folk ensemble in the 1940s. BBC News.
Hello, this is World Book Club, and with us answering questions about Eva Luna, a story of a young girl's journey through danger, revolution and romance, is the internationally best-selling Chilean author Isabel Allende. And we've got a question now that comes from Seville, from Spain, from Javier Sancho Mas, and he sent this into the program earlier.
Hello, thank you for having me here. Hola Isabel, ¿cómo está? My name is Javier Sancho. I'm from Huelva in Andalusia in the south of Spain, but also with a second nationality from Nicaragua. And this is my question for you. Let's go. Traditionally, fictional writers in Latin America have a long tradition of political involvement and political approach in their novels. So do you think that is still happening today? And in addition, a second question, do you think is any political regime actually afraid of writers? Thank you so much.
So, obviously fiction writers in Latin America do have a long tradition of political involvement in their novels. Is it still happening? And is there any government, any regime that is frightening?
മോളെ കിട്ടുന്നില്ലേ കിട്ടുന്നില്ലേ കിട്ടുന്നില്ല അവിടെ ഇരിപ്പുണ്ട് ലാപ്പിൽ സെറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് വെച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്
imagine and to move events. I'm not stuck to real facts. For example, if an earthquake in real life happens in 1996 and I want to move it to 1998 because it's more convenient for my story, if I name the country, I cannot do that. But if I don't, I have more freedom. On the other hand, many of the events that I tell, a military coup or a dictatorship or repression and torture, and all, it happens in so many places that naming just one country limits the experience.
Georgia, does that make sense to you?
Yes, probably does.
You sound reluctant. Isabel Allende, thank you very much. And we have a question now from Omaira Velez, who's in Florida. And this is what she wants to ask you.
Hello, my name is Omaira Velez, and I am from Hernando, Florida. I just want to say that Isabel was one of the authors that inspired me to be a writer. I have a question for her. I'd like to know if that part with the releasing of the 9 prisoners by the guerrillas, if it was based on true events. Thank you.
Yes, so at one point the guerrillas released 9 of their comrades from prison. Was this based on true events?
That event in particular is fiction, but it is based on events that really have happened. For example, in Uruguay, a group of guerrillas were able to escape, and it was a famous case. Also, when I was living in Venezuela, that was in the 70s, democracy.
अंकल मैं गूगल पे कर दूँ ना
लो ये भी कोई पूछने की बात है आप तो ये पूछो कि हमारी शॉप पे होम डिलीवरी होती है
ऐसे लाखों मेडिकल स्टोर्स पे गूगल पे से क्यूआर पेमेंट कर सकते हो तो कोई और सवाल पूछो
मुत्तशन प्रसिद्ध का
Venezuela was relatively new because the last dictatorship had ended in 1959, so a decade or so before. My best friend there actually had been a guerrilla. He was a doctor and he had worked with the guerrillas as a doctor. So much of what I tell about that life in the jungle and about the conditions of the guerrilla fight, I got it from him.
Isabel Allende, before the break, we heard a reading where 2 of the most significant men in Eva Luna's life are together in the mountains. We've got a question about them both now from Kim De Silva in Trinidad and Tobago, who's still on the telephone. This is a question about the 2 men, Rolf and Humberto. Kim.
Hello, thank you again. I was wondering, given that Eva spends so much of her childhood and adolescence with Humberto, why Rolf? Why does Eva eventually find her true love with Rolf instead?
Would you like to be with a guerrilla guy who's never available, who is always angry, who might get killed in any moment? Is he a reliable companion? I don't think so. Of course, I think so. I was totally in love with Roberto Naranjo because I always liked the dark, threatening, brave, courageous hero. I love them, but you can't live with those people. It's like living with a saint. Who wants that? So I needed to get rid of Roberto Naranjo at some point and replace him for someone that would be easier to live with, someone I would like to live with. So that's how Rolf appeared.
I think, is there also something, because it seems to me that Eva is very ambivalent about Roberto's revolution, that she admires and respects very much what he's doing, but she does question, firstly, whether, if he came to power, if the revolution succeeded, whether it would be a revolution for women, or whether they would find themselves in exactly the same sort of place. And also there's a feeling that she wonders whether a successful revolutionary mightn't become in turns rather dictatorial.
Yes, and her doubts are based on reality, really, because I remember in the 60s and early 70s when people were talking about changing the world with socialism. Well, socialism was just meant for men. Women would still have the same domestic role in socialism or not, and unless they would fight for their own rights. So she wonders about that. But also, what happened in some cases in Latin America, in some countries in Latin America, is that the guerrilla was finally pacified, and it became, in many instances, a political party. But when they were in power, they were just as bad as the other ones. They had forgotten everything that they had fought for, and they were just as corrupt. So you have to doubt the intentions once they get the power they are looking for. And she does. Eva Luna is very clear about that.
Isabel Allende, thank you. And thank you, Kim da Silva, for your question. We're going now to Venezuela, in fact, specifically to Margarita Island, Venezuela, where Julio Avila has sent this question for you, Isabel Allende.
Hello, Mrs. Allende. This is Julio Avila from Venezuela. I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to be asking this question for you today. I've been reading your books since I was a kid, and I noticed how often you describe the pain, collective and individual, with optimism, as something that can improve your characters and be positive with the pass of time. So I wanted to ask you, it is necessary to let the pain rest to write about it, or it is possible to write about it while we're still going through that pain? Thank you very much for having me, and greetings from Margarita Island.
So Julio Avila says that you seem optimistic about the fact that pain, individual or collective pain, can improve characters and be positive with the passing of time. But he wants to know, do you think it's necessary to let the pain rest in order to write about it? Or is it possible to write about it while we are still going through the pain?
I don't know for other writers, but in general, you need time and sometimes space to process the pain and transform it. Although in my case, when I lost my daughter, Paula, she died prematurely and broke my heart. She died on December 6, 1992. And a month later, on January 8th, which is the day I start all my books, and I could sort of exorcise the pain, get to understand what had happened and accept it through the writing. But that's rare. In general, for example, writers who have written about the Holocaust or writers who have written about other traumatic experiences, usually those books appear much later, after the writer and sometimes the collective has made sense of it. So to write fiction, you need distance, some distance. It could be in time or it could be emotional distance. It is rare to do what I did, which is write in the middle of the anger and the pain and the mourning. I realized then that everybody has losses in their lives, and we all go through some pain of some kind sooner or later. And some people get depressed and become paralyzed by it, and some people become stronger. And some societies also become stronger.
Isabel Allende, thank you very much. And I think time for another reading from Eva Luna. We've been talking about writing, and this is a passage where Eva, who's been scribbling this and that for years in her notebooks, one day she's actually given a beautiful present by Mimi. She's given a typewriter.
I awakened early. It was a soft and slightly rainy Wednesday, not very different from others in my life, but I treasure that Wednesday as a special day, one that belonged only to me. Ever since the school teacher Inés had taught me the alphabet, I had written almost every night, but I felt that today was different, something that could change my life. I poured a cup of black coffee and sat down at the typewriter. I took a clean white piece of paper, like a sheet freshly ironed for making love, and rolled it into the carriage. Then I felt something odd, like a pleasant tickling in my bones, a breeze blowing through the network of veins beneath my skin. I believed that that page had been waiting for me for more than 20 years, that I have lived only for that instant, and I hope that from that moment, my only task would be to capture the stories floating in the thin air, to make them mine. I wrote my name, and immediately the words began to flow, one thing linked to the other and another, Characters stepped from the shadows where they had been hidden for years into the light of that Wednesday, each with a face, a voice, passions and obsessions. I could see an order to the stories stored in my genetic memory since before my birth, and the many others I had been writing for years in my notebooks.
I have to say that's one of my favourite sentences in the entire book, the idea that you freshly iron your sheets before making love.
Do you ever do that, Harry?
No, I never do that.
Well, you should.
Okay, Isabel Allende, thank you. We've got a question now from Anna Maria Porceluzzi, who's from Bari in the south of Italy. And this is what she wanted to ask you.
Hello, I'm Anna Maria Porceluzzi. I'm calling from Bari in Italy. I graduated in Spanish and South American literature, and I am a big admirer of your books. My question is more about magical realism, which is such a strong presence in Eva Luna. Reading your novels, and obviously the works of Garcia Marquez, Amado, Borges, I've always wondered how much magical realism is present in everyday life in South America, how much it mingles with reality, and how easy it is to find it, and therefore make it become part of a literary work. Thank you.
It's very interesting, but magic realism is just life, and everybody's life, everywhere in the world, it can be extraordinary. It depends on how you tell it. The trick for magic realism that Garcia Marquez once explained is to tell the ordinary things in an extraordinary language, exaggerated language, and to tell extraordinary events in a matter of fact tone. For example, in 100 Years of Solitude, at one point, one of the characters discovers that the earth is not flat, the earth is round. And then in an extraordinary language, everybody thinks he's crazy. And then in a very natural tone, he tells that someone rose to heaven in body and soul. And it's told in such a way that you accept it. You take it, okay, that's the way it was. Now, the idea of magic realism began really in Germany, but it was taken to South America. I live in the United States, and when people tell me that we are superstitious in Latin America and all this magic realism thing is a proof of that, I remind them that there are many writers in the United States, especially writers of color, who are more magical than any of us. For example, Toni Morrison and many others. And also here, people hang crystals around their necks, they consult astrologers and psychics and tarot readers, and all that is not superstition. It's not Latin America, give me a break.
Isabel Allende, thank you very much for that. And we've got somebody waiting on the telephone for you now, Zohar Laor. He's in the east coast of the United States. Zohar, hello. Whereabouts on the east coast? It's quite a long stretch of land, that.
Yes, it is. Delaware.
Oh, you're in Delaware. Your question for Isabel Allende.
I'm glad to be talking to you, Miss Allende. I've been reading your books for years. Believe it or not, Zorro was the first book I read of yours. That's how I was introduced to your writing. So before my question, I have a blog for the past 12 years at menoflawbook.com, and I got a hold of Violeta, which is your new novel, which was really excellent. I have to say that I really enjoyed it. My question is, what are the challenges of writing and translating between English and Spanish while keeping the intention of the narrative and the dialogue organic?
My books are translated to many languages, and of course I cannot control or even read all of them except English. So I have to trust that the publisher and the editors take good care of the translation. But I am very careful with the English translation because I can read it in English, and also because many of the translators from other languages check, they of course they translate from Spanish, but they check the English translation sometimes. So it's very important that that be accurate. I have had for many, many years Margaret Sawyer Peden as my translator, and she was fantastic. And we worked so closely that we had a sort of psychic connection. I could guess things about her life, and she could guess what was going to happen in mine. But unfortunately, she retired at a certain point because she felt that she was too old. When I wrote Maya's Notebook, it is told in the voice of a young woman. And Margaret, who was over 80, said, I can't get the voice. I cannot do this anymore. So now I have had other translators, and they have been absolutely great.
Isabel Allende, thank you. We're going now to Caracas in Venezuela, where Gerardo Gonzalez is on the telephone. Gerardo, hello.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to speak to you, Isabel. Everybody knows that Isabel Allende lived in Venezuela, in my country, for a long time. And I was wondering if you could tell us if there's any specific thing about Venezuela that inspired you to write episodes in Eva Luna. How did that period of living in my country influence your writing? Thank you very much.
So how was Eva Luna influenced by your living in Venezuela?
Look, I don't think I would be a writer today without my experience in Venezuela. I wouldn't be able to write the stories I write now, let alone Eva Luna. Eva Luna is a completely Venezuelan story. Many of the anecdotes, for example, the grandmother Elvira that is found floating in her coffin, that happened in Venezuela. I saw it in the newspaper. You could read in the tabloids in Venezuela, crazy stuff. Of course, probably half of it was made up, so that a child was born with two heads and one was black and the other one was white. Probably that was made up, but it was in the tabloids. So I collected those clippings. Plus, I was coming from a country that was living in repression, in a dictatorship with censorship, where life is sober also. We are Andean, we do not have the African influence, the Caribbean happiness and sense of joy and celebration. And I arrived in Venezuela and I found myself in a country that was, to begin with, democratic. It was full of people that came from all over the world, each one with their stories and their languages and their problems. And they sort of mingled in this country that was open and generous and with a sense of joy. Any excuse was good for a party, very different from Chile. And that changed me in many ways. All those 13 years in Venezuela changed my way of seeing life. It freed me from so many complexes and little things that kept me tied. So I am extremely grateful to your country.
Thank you very much. Very, very kind words, Isabel. Muchísimas gracias.
Well, Gerardo, thank you for your question. And you talk about this repression and dictatorship in the Chile that you left, Isabel Allende. But these days, with its very young new president, do you feel more optimistic about it?
Well, we have had many, many years of democracy in Chile. Governments of center-left and center-right. According to the polls and the statistics, you would see that it was a country that was doing very well, the best in Latin America. However, in October of 2019, they raised the fare of the subway by 4 cents. It was nothing. And there was what they have called estallido, which means the explosion that brought everybody into the streets. And you had suddenly 1 million people in the streets of Santiago and in other cities as well. Very rapidly, there was an awareness that people were fed up with inequality, with the fact that all the money was in a few hands. The pensions for the old people were miserable. They couldn't even eat. People wanted to change the constitution that had been imposed by the dictatorship in the 80s. And so all this anger was channeled into this idea of changing the constitution. And they chose 155 people to draft the new constitution, which would be a constitution with gender parity, women in power as many as men, inclusive, especially the native peoples of the country. They were beginning to plan this when the pandemic hit, and everything stopped and got like frozen in time. But we had an election, and the election was in November. The two candidates, one was extreme right, and the other one was a socialist called Boric. And Boric won by a high majority. It was really a landslide. And so now we will have this very young, 35-year-old leftist young man who is very mature, a very clear idea of what this new constitution will do and what kind of country we want. And I think that that's a fantastic question that very few countries can ask today. What kind of country do we want? How can we have equality, inclusion, diversity, gender parity, respect for nature and climate change? So we'll see. And I am very optimistic because it is a moment of hope for a new country.
Isabel Allende, thank you very much for that. And on that optimistic note, we have to leave it. Next month, in our season celebrating the exuberance of youth, we'll be joined by American author Kylie Reid, who'll be chatting with readers about her debut novel, Such a Fun Age, a sharp-eyed look at class, race and youth that's as funny as it's thought-provoking. To ask Kylie Reid your question about the book, just email it to us or tweet us at BBCWBC. All relevant details are on our website, where you can also download well over 200 World Book Club podcasts, interviews with the world's best-loved authors, from Alice Walker to Marianne Keyes, from Adaf Swaif to Tim Winton. But for now, from me, Harriet Gilbert, and producer Karen Holden, thank you to our skillful sound engineer, Duncan Hannant, to Jill Huggett and Rick Wasker for marshalling your questions, to all you members of BBC World Book Club, wherever you are, and above all, a massive thank you to this month's guest, Isabel Allende.
Thank you, Harriet. Thank you very much.
This is the BBC World Service, where our series, Women Building Peace, continues. We're hearing from women trying to make a difference in conflict zones. In episode 2, we look at post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina.
I think the political activism of women did change the landscape of Bosnia.
But tensions in the country are rising again.
The situation is dangerous for Europe as a whole.
Women Building Peace at bbcworldservice.com. And in 30 minutes, the Cultural Frontline with Chichi Azundu.
As China hosts the Winter Olympics, we hear from artists at the heart of the international sporting event, and from authors, painters and musicians pushing the boundaries of contemporary Chinese art today.
Stay with us. From Our Own Correspondent is next, here on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
On From Our Own Correspondent after the bulletin, a young woman has her conviction for lying about an alleged rape overturned.
The latest court hearing in Nicosia marked a stunning reverse and indictment of that original trial. The alleged victim had suffered a miscarriage of justice.
The women and girls fighting for their rights in Afghanistan.
I asked my children to put on burial shrouds and told them we may get killed today, but we have to accept that, because if it brings some kind of change, then it'll be worth it.
And in Myanmar, we meet the young men challenging military rule.
Frank now has a scar from a bullet wound in his thigh, and George describes how he had to flee in a hail of bullets, convinced he was going to die, and thinking only of his baby daughter, whom he's not yet seen.
All that on From Our Own Correspondent, with me, Pascal Harter, after this bulletin of BBC World News.
Hello, this is Danielle Yawowiecka with the BBC News. Reports from the United States say security officials have warned that a Russian invasion of Ukraine could cause as many as 50,000 civilian deaths. Politicians in Washington were briefed on the latest US intelligence this week by senior members of the Biden administration. Here's Rory Gallimore.
Russia has repeatedly denied that it's planning to invade Ukraine, but American officials warn Moscow has already amassed about 70% of the forces needed for a full-scale attack. If that were to happen, the officials say Russia's advance would be swift. They estimate that the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, could fall within days, prompting a refugee crisis as millions of people flee. These warnings are not definitive predictions and are likely to be dismissed as fantasy by the Kremlin. US officials also stress that they can't tell whether President Putin has made a final decision on whether to carry out an invasion.
King Mohammed of Morocco has offered his condolences in a phone call to the parents of a boy who died after falling down a well on Tuesday. Rayan was pulled from the 30-metre deep well on Saturday following a rescue effort that attracted global attention. His death was confirmed shortly after. The authorities in Peru have authorized the Spanish oil company Repsol to reopen a refinery that closed after a huge spill. Our America's editor Leonardo Rocha explains why the Peruvian government was under pressure to act.
La Pampilla refinery provides about 40% of all the fuel in the country and about 2/3 of the petrol fuel. It's the biggest refinery. There are queues outside petrol stations and concerns that in 2 or 3 days the country would run out of diesel and petrol. So they were in a very difficult situation and they decided to give this temporary permission for them to reopen for 10 days. And Repsol, what they say is it was an accident. They're doing all that they can to clean up and it will all be finished, that cleaning up operation, by the end of March.
The authorities in the Mexican state of Zacatecas are investigating the murder of 16 people, whose deaths are thought to be linked to an intensifying struggle between drugs gangs. Will Grant has the details.
The states which suffer the worst of Mexico's drug violence change over time as the country's drug cartels fight over control of fresh turf. One of those currently in dispute is the northern state of Zacatecas. In a single day, 16 bodies were found in 2 cities in the state, 10 of them in Fresnillo, the other 6 in General Pánfilo Natera. As is so often the case in Mexico, exactly who carried out the crimes isn't clear. However, a battle has been raging in the state between the Sinaloa cartel and their rivals, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, with the latter growing increasingly powerful in various parts of the country.
World News from the BBC. Canada has seen another weekend of large protests against COVID measures, with thousands of people taking part. Many joined an encampment in the centre of the capital, Ottawa, which has been gridlocked for days. In Toronto, lorries were used to block a major intersection. The protests, known as the Freedom Convoy, were started by truckers angry at vaccine requirements. The Tunisian President Kais Saied has moved to dissolve the country's Supreme Judicial Council. In a late-night statement, he said the council should consider itself a thing of the past. He gave no further details. President Saied has ruled by decree since last July. Queen Elizabeth has said it's her wish that Camilla, the wife of her son Prince Charles, take the title of Queen Consort when he eventually takes the British throne. The Queen's wishes were part of a Platinum Jubilee message issued for the 70th anniversary of her accession. Here's our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond.
Today, the Queen writes, is not only the 70th anniversary of her accession, it's also 70 years since the death of her father, King George VI. She was only 25 years old. As the anniversary of accession is marked, she renews the pledge she gave more than 7 decades ago, that her life will be devoted to service. When, she writes, in the fullness of time, her son Prince Charles becomes king, the Queen asks that his wife Camilla be known as Queen Consort. Since their marriage, there have been questions around what Camilla's role and title would be. The Queen has now settled that.
The snowboarder Zoe Zadowski-Synnott has secured New Zealand's first ever gold medal at a Winter Olympics. She won the slopestyle event at the Beijing Games on her final run. Zadowski-Synnott impressed the judges by leaping off huge jumps and sliding across the roof of a traditional Chinese house made from snow. BBC News.
You're listening to From Our Own Correspondent here on the BBC World Service. I'm Pascal Harter. Hello and welcome to the programme. In this edition, we're in Afghanistan, where we meet women and girls determined not to be erased from public life. We're also inside a courtroom in Cyprus, where a young woman has her conviction for lying about an alleged rape overturned. And we visit the tiny community radio station casting a huge emotional safety net to Tongan people all over the world. But first, it has been a year since the military in Myanmar seized power, overthrowing the elected government of Aung San Suu Kyi. The takeover was deeply unpopular. It sparked a nationwide civil disobedience campaign in which thousands of Burmese people tried to reverse the coup through peaceful protest. The military, though, made arrests and opened fire on protesters, suppressing that campaign. But the resistance to the junta is not dying down. Many have joined an armed movement which is challenging military rule in much of the country. Jonathan Head has been speaking to some of these volunteers and reflects on what's driving them to keep fighting against formidable odds. For their safety, we have changed their names.
George is a small and slightly built man with a soft voice and hair grown long and straggly after months of neglect in the jungle. His friend Frank is baby-faced, wearing fashionable, oversized glasses. Neither looks much like a fighter. George used to be a travelling salesman, and Frank worked in an ice cream parlour. Yet both have recently been in battle. Brutal, chaotic encounters with an army much better armed and trained than they are. Frank now has a scar from a bullet wound in his thigh, and George describes how he had to flee in a hail of bullets, convinced he was going to die, and thinking only of his baby daughter, who was born only days before the battle and whom he's not yet seen. So, what is it that's propelled these two young men and thousands like them to give up their comfortable city lives and volunteer to endure months of grueling training and to keep up their unequal struggle against such a powerful foe? Few were surprised by the huge street rallies that came out last year against the coup. Everywhere in Myanmar, there was a sense of disbelief and outrage that the army would dare to overthrow a government which had won a decisive election victory just 3 months earlier. But once the generals ordered their troops to gun down the protesters, their numbers dwindled, and it seemed that open defiance of the coup might peter out. That hasn't happened. Instead, young activists, more familiar with keyboards than Kalashnikovs, who'd wielded nothing more deadly than a slingshot, started planning how they would fight back against one of the world's most ruthless military machines. In part, they're driven by grief and anger after seeing their friends shot dead in the streets. George tracks his decision to join the armed resistance back to the day when he helped carry a young man dying from a head wound away from a demonstration. They had given us no choice, he says. But there is something else fueling this spontaneous, youthful insurgency. It's a better future, glimpsed and dreamed by those who'd come of age during Myanmar's 10-year democratic experiment, which has now been stolen by the same soldiers who denied such a future to previous generations. In those 10 years, life for so many in Myanmar was transformed. Mobile phones became widely available for the first time, and with them, access to all kinds of information. They brought easy and instant communication with each other and with other countries, and a whole range of business opportunities. More foreign investors and tourists came. For the first time, people in Myanmar believed they had a chance of catching up with their neighbours. I can remember the fizzing sense of excitement in young entrepreneurs I spoke to 9 years ago that they could finally join the race to prosperity in Southeast Asia, which until then they'd only been able to watch longingly. Today, as the new military rulers snuff out internet connections and lock up opponents, just as their predecessors did, all that hope has been extinguished. What's happening in Myanmar now is something not seen in this region since the Vietnam War, a nationwide armed uprising against an unpopular regime. They're calling it a revolution, trying, they say, to cut out the cancer of an armed forces which refuses to relinquish power. Sure, there's been plenty of political turmoil in neighbouring countries too. Over the past 25 years, I've seen hundreds killed in such turmoil and seen half a dozen governments felled by military coups or people power movements. But in all these upheavals, the violence was quickly contained and the changes limited to a few political leaders at the top, because most people had kept enough faith in the directions their countries were taking to think it unnecessary to take up arms. Governments in Southeast Asia may be democratic or autocratic, but they are, by and large, pragmatic. They've all embraced the economic growth offered by globalization, and so have been able to hold out to their people the promise of better living standards. All except the military governments which ran Myanmar for 50 years and mismanaged the economy so disastrously it used to rank among the world's worst in areas like health and education. Today, young Burmese have shown that they're willing to fight and die to stop the generals who so blighted the lives of their parents from dragging them back to that dismal past.
Jonathan Head. The Taliban are making much of a declaration that they are allowing public universities in Afghanistan to reopen. For the US and other donors, access to education for women and girls is a central demand in return for restarting aid to the country. Meanwhile, some schools have allowed teenaged girls back, but the vast majority remain stuck at home. On a recent visit, Yalda Hakim found a longing to get back to learning.
I've been reporting from Afghanistan for almost 15 years. I also have a very personal and deep connection with this nation. It is the country of my birth. My family fled Afghanistan in 1983 in the dead of night, 4 years after the Soviet invasion. My parents locked up their home in central Kabul, promising never to return to a country descending into a war that would go on to claim millions of lives. I was just 6 months old, strapped to my mother's back. Returning now to a place I felt I no longer knew filled me with sadness. The people I had met over the years, journalists, judges, activists, artists, politicians, who made the city of Kabul a vibrant, even cosmopolitan place, had all left. But millions of people remain in the country and are now dealing with the realities of life under the Taliban's new Islamic Emirates. In a park in the center of Kabul, I met Sheila Dost. Draped in a dark brown cloak, Sheila's hair was covered with a black headscarf, and I wondered if she was dressing more conservatively now that the Taliban were back. She told me nothing about her appearance or dress has changed. In fact, she continues to wear her signature brown lipstick to remind her of all the things she once enjoyed. Sheila told me for her and her husband, fleeing the country was never an option. If we all leave, who stays to fight for our rights? The mother of 3 holds back tears as she told me about the day she brought her 2 young children to demonstrate against Taliban restrictions on girls' education. I asked my children to put on burial shrouds and told them we may get killed today, but we have to accept that because if it brings some kind of change, then it'll be worth it. Before the Taliban seized control of Afghanistan in August, Sheila was a teacher at a secondary school. But like thousands of other female government workers, she was ordered to stop going to work by the country's new rulers. She now sits at home alongside her 12-year-old daughter Mursal, who has also been banned from attending school. Sheila told me she refuses to be erased from public life and must continue to fight for the rights of Afghan girls and women. We can't just breathe, we have to live. We must now either live a dignified life or die for our country and for our basic human rights. It is this steely determination which gives Sheila and a small band of women the courage to take to the streets, protesting for their rights, risking beatings, arrests, or even worse. Some of the female protesters I've spoken to tell me they've had Taliban gunmen point weapons at them, spray them with pepper spray, and shout insults. There are also disturbing reports in the past few weeks that 2 female activists, Tamana Paryani and Parwana Ibrahimkhel, have been abducted. When I asked the Taliban about this case, they deny they were behind the detention of the women, whose whereabouts and well-being remain unknown. Their disappearance has sent a chill across Afghan civil society, with many women's rights activists going into hiding, others demanding answers from the now de facto government. When the Taliban first rose to power in the 1990s, it instilled fear through brutal rule. So afraid were the Afghan people of Taliban-style law and order that any kind of dissent was unthinkable. Yet the Taliban of 2021 is dealing with a very different Afghanistan. In particular, the urban and educated youth, they had no desire to stay in a country where they felt their most fundamental values and beliefs would no longer be tolerated. The young women I met in Kabul all told me they refused to be intimidated and surrender the rights that the last 20 years opened for them. But as the Taliban transitions from insurgency to government and tightens their grip on power, I wondered if their courage would be enough.
That was Yalda Hakim. You're listening to From Our Own Correspondent here on the BBC World Service with me, Pascal Harter. Next, to Cyprus, and the story of a British woman determined to be believed. 3 years ago, she went on holiday to the party resort of Ayia Napa. There, she says she was raped by a group of men. She went to the police for help. After hours of interrogation without a lawyer, she says she was pressured into retracting her allegation. She then found herself put on trial and was convicted of causing public mischief. Now, the Supreme Court in Cyprus has overturned the original conviction. Anna Holigan was there.
We were crammed thigh to thigh on the sticky wooden benches. Chants of "we believe her," "no means no." Voices dripping with fury, frustration, wafted through the blinds on the occasional welcome breeze. This was 2019. The claustrophobic regional courtroom in Paralimni made an unlikely theatre for an audience of international reporters. Standing anxiously in the dock, a teenager with a loose bun and white knit jumper fumbled with her necklace. I saw the moment she heard the cries from the activists gathered outside and glanced at her mother. They shared a look and the same fear, that the judge wouldn't believe her. "It's crazy," the shy young woman told me before the hearing, shaking her head. "I was meant to be starting my degree. I just came here to do some growing up and... yeah, look." She'd shrugged, exasperated, as her voice trailed off. You may think you already know her story. Covering the furore over an alleged gang rape and the way Cyprus has followed up the case brought me back several times to the island and its resorts pulsating with promises, cheap cocktails, sun, and yes, possibly a holiday romance so intoxicating it will feel like the love of your life. And we know too what happened next to that young woman. The judge in Paralimni, who'd repeatedly shouted down her female lawyer during the hearings, refused to hear any of the forensic evidence of the alleged gang rape and found her guilty of public mischief, citing her signature on a retraction statement which stated she'd reported a fake crime. The young woman had been kept in jail for a month after the allegation, then in Cyprus for 6 months before that trial in Paralimni. She was convicted and given a suspended 4-month jail sentence. Her lawyers appealed. They argued that paper had been signed under duress after more than 7 hours of relentless police pressure applied on a teenager already suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder in a cell without a lawyer or translator present. And so the press returned to Cyprus to cover the appeal ruling from the Supreme Court judge in Nicosia. The minute I landed, every man I encountered, from the taxi driver to the hotel receptionist, asked why I was there, before sharing, unprompted, their own prejudices about the case. Much of what they said starkly revealed the barriers women can face in getting a fair trial, and ultimately why so many victims are deterred from reporting sexual crimes. Here are just some of the things I heard. She wanted the fame, the money. She's giving Cyprus a bad name, making us look like a backward nation, said one man. Have you seen the British girls who come here? Asked another. And yet another. And what about the men? They were accused. They're the victims too. Other remarks soon veered into baseless speculation about the accuser's own character. To me, this was startling, but the bare facts of how the legal process had played out were astonishing enough. The initial rape allegation was never fully investigated. The group of tourists she'd accused were arrested, rounded up for questioning, and denied the charge. DNA samples from 5 of them were found on her face and body, but all of the alleged attackers were released without charge the day after she signed that retraction statement. But the latest court hearing in Nicosia marked a stunning reverse and indictment of that original trial. The alleged victim had suffered a miscarriage of justice, at least at the hands of the Cypriot justice system. That was the final judgment from the country's highest court. On the steps outside, a cluster of supporters who'd braved the rain, galvanized by a case that's horrified women's rights advocates around the world, told me it was a bittersweet victory.
With curls falling across her eyes, squinting into the sun, one of them, Raf, explained, "She shouldn't be the one on trial. She shouldn't be criminalized. Her name shouldn't be dragged through the mud, and we demand that those who assaulted her be held accountable instead." Her family told me that for true justice to be done, the original rape allegation should now be fully, thoroughly investigated. Reporting sexual attacks to the police, reliving the experience, and enduring a trial can be another harrowing ordeal for survivors. The fear that the public will be judging their character is also a deterrent. Not every accusation is investigated, not every rape case goes to trial, and not every rape trial results in a verdict. But when the rape accusations can end up with the alleged victim being put on trial, surely the system needs reform. When I asked the young woman in this case what she'd do if she was cleared, her answer was simple. She just wanted to get on with her life and her studies.
Anna Holligan. The volcanic eruption and tsunami which struck the Kingdom of Tonga last month caused catastrophic damage, covering communities in ash and cutting the undersea cable connecting Tonga to the outside world. Some communication has now returned, but for Tongans living abroad, it's been a very anxious time. As they wait for news, they have found support from a community broadcaster in Australia. Simon Atkinson went to visit.
Dutifully obeying my car's navigation system, I turned left into the very ordinary suburban street. I was assured, reached my destination, following a path at the side of the weatherboard house. A smiling, slightly tired-looking woman waved from the balcony above. "Are you looking for Suli?" she asked. "He won't be long. Go on through to the studio. We're on air in a few minutes." For the past couple of years, this innocuous Brisbane property has been home to an internet broadcaster, Pacifica TV and Radio. Its target audience is the diaspora of the Kingdom of Tonga, and on a good day, a couple of hundred people from all across the globe watch or listen to its programs. But the disaster in Tonga has given this community service a new sense of purpose, and with it, a whole new audience, several thousand of them. I find the studio entrance, past the washing machine in the basement laundry. A sign for the station is obscured by a kettle and some cups, stained with the coffee that's been powering its volunteers to broadcast late into the night. Among them is Suli Late, the driving force behind the station, who also happens to live upstairs. He explains that when the volcano erupted from the sea floor, covering the nation in ash, it also took with it an undersea cable, bringing down internet and telephone connections. And with communication lost, this station, broadcasting across the world in the Tongan language, filled a void. "We started off covering the breaking news," he says, "but when people couldn't talk to their loved ones at home, they talked to us instead." For Suli, some of the most moving calls have come from close to home. Young Tongans, mainly men, living in rural Australia. They're here doing hard manual jobs that Australians won't, like picking fruit. And the wages these men and women earn are usually sent home to pay rent, school fees, and to support families whose fate after the disaster they knew little about. I hear these men break down in tears on air, Suli tells me, talking about their mums and dads, their wives and children back home. It's just heartbreaking. I stand at the back of the studio as the broadcast resumes and the phone lines open again. I don't understand the language, but there's no mistake. The first caller's voice drops. Hey, is it a breath? A sob. Also welling up is co-presenter Melanie Nikomo, who for days has been patiently listening to calls, offering words of comfort, all while carrying her own worries. The previous night I'd seen her interviewed on the local TV news channel. Tearful, she spoke about the last time she'd heard from her brother and two sisters in Tonga. They'd heard the eruption, she said. There was a tsunami warning, but the route to higher ground was blocked by lines of cars packed with others doing exactly the same. They'd sent Melee a photo showing the car.
Hello, good morning, good morning.
That was it.
ഞാനിവിടെ നാട്ടുമ്പുറത്താണ്. I'm in my village, spending some time with my parents.
Messages in a family
looking at the beautiful trees and plants and green leaves. ഇതെല്ലാം കാണാൻ രസമുണ്ട്. നല്ല ഒരു വെയിലൊക്കെ കൊണ്ടിങ്ങനെ പുറത്തേക്ക് നോക്കിയിരിക്കുകയാണ്. ഗുഡ് മോർണിംഗ്. താങ്ക് യു. With my parents here in the village. Thank you all.
A couple of days after my visit, communications in Tonga began to improve a little. At least, comments were expected to be sent emails that made calls. LA discovered that her brother and two sisters were safe. Like many journalists in this region, we've been trying to get to Tonga since the eruption. The Tongan government is keen not to have one disaster, but undoubtedly be another, a large outbreak of COVID-19. The borders are staying shut. International aid workers, never mind international media, are being kept away. Even with those measures, though, Tonga has gone into lockdown after cases were discovered at the main port where aid is being delivered. Because of this, and because it's still likely to be weeks until Tonga's internet services are up and running again properly, Pacific TV and radio in Brisbane is still going strong, united by a circle of news. So togetherness as audiences stay loyal. We just have a local station, so we translate. Trying to get today.
That was Simon Atkinson bringing this edition to you. I'm Pascal Harter. Producer was Diana Richardson. And we'll be back next week with more stories of the lives.
But the reality has turned out to be very different. Research has shown that young people are having less sex than previous generations.
Sex can be a part of a relationship for me, but I don't need it to be.
I'm Anushka Matanda-Dawati, and I'll be finding out how social media has impacted on my generation's approach to sex, and what other factors might explain why people in their 20s, at least in some parts of the world, are having less of it.
It would be nice to think that decline was a consequence of people having sex when they wanted to, and not when they felt pressured into doing so.
Join me as I hear stories of the no satisfaction generation.
No Satisfaction, Tuesday at 9:20 GMT.
This week on the Cultural Frontline, as China hosts the Winter Olympics, we hear from the artists celebrating the event and pushing boundaries. Coming up, painter Chu Lele on people's vulnerability to misinformation.
We don't know what is truth, what is false.
Plus, science fiction authors Chen Fan and Xia Jia on creating alternative Chinese futures. More on the Culture Frontline after the latest BBC News.
BBC News with Danielle Yawowiecka. Reports from the United States say security officials have warned that a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Denied planning to invade. King Mohammed of Morocco has offered his condolences to the parents of a boy who attracted global attention. His death was confirmed a short time later. The Tunisian President Kais Saied has moved to dissolve the country's Supreme Judicial Council. Mr. Saied said the council should consider itself a thing of the past. He's ruled by decree since he sacked the government last July.